Hello and welcome to this lecture on the self in social cognition. So in this initial video we're going to focus on what is it that makes up our sense of self, what are the factors that go into this, and what is it influenced by, particularly with a focus on culture. In the following video we're going to look at how elements of our self can serve a function, particularly to motivate behaviour. So if I start off by just asking you, who are you? What would you say? How would you go about describing yourself to me? What are the terms that you would use to describe yourself? So in a kind of early attempt to study people's self-concepts, there was work that was done by Manfred Kuhn and Thomas McPartland, who developed what was known as the 20 statements test. And it's really just a very simple thing that they ask people to list out or complete a sentence, I am, 20 times over. So you would add a value or a trait in there, such as I am honest, I am kind, I am a parent, etc. And the goal of their work was to just uncover what are the components that make up people's core central self. So I want you, before we start this lecture, just to take a couple of minutes to record your responses to at least 10 statements. As you do this, reflect on any challenges or difficulties you have in defining your self-concept here. And it's going to be really useful for you to do this, just because we're going to return to these concepts and the types of answers that you give a little bit later on. So when asked this question of who you are, the entire collection of beliefs that we have about ourselves can be thought to comprise what's known as a global self-concept. And this global self-concept is something that is multifaceted, so it has lots of different elements about our traits, so long-term stable personality traits. It's got the values, the things that we feel are important. You may also have elements of feeling, specific memories, social roles, etc. And we might feel like our self-concept is something that develops and forms independently. Surely I am the person who defines who I am. And that's sort of true, but in reality a lot of our self-concept is produced or the product of the social world that's around us. So it comes from our interactions with and our reactions to other people in the world. So at one level we might have specific personal experiences and events that occur. So these could be independent. Examples would be a book that you read, the videos that you watch, and the life lessons from these are something that might shape your own self-concept. It's also going to come from interactions with family and friends. So how other people treat us, what role models we have, etc. And then cultural factors. So what within your society is valued and positively emphasized, that is going to shape the sorts of self-concepts that we want to behold. So if you grow up in a culture that values a particular trait, such as being a good friend, then that would be a self-concept that you would want to attain yourself. So we can look at an example here of an individual whose experience, family, friends, interaction and culture leads to them having some elements of a global self-concept that includes being thoughtful, relaxed, adventurous, caring. And then we can also have negative descriptors, so things that definitely don't define us. So for example, being mean and cold could be two parts of the self-concept that we know we are not. And then within this we can also have attributes that we think are absolutely central and really important to us, so things that are very well developed. And these are things, when you're listing out I am, the ones that would come out of your head right at the very top, that would be the most accessible. So we have things that are sort of central, and then we also have more peripheral elements that go into this self-concept. Now I've mentioned a couple of times that we have this multifaceted nature of the self-concept, And generally, the sorts of self-statements that people use can be fitted into one of four categories. So when considering the self-concept, Kuhn proposed that our statements relate to either category A, which is conception of selves as a physical structure. So you might define yourself as, I am someone who's tall, short, fat, small, thin, etc. Category B is where the self is identified in terms of your particular role. So it could be, I'm a student, I'm a daughter, I'm a son, etc. They can be category C, your role as a social actor, also known as reflective. So the way that you behave and interact with the environment around you. I am confident, I'm timid, I'm extroverted, etc. That'll all be part of category C. Or category D, conception of the self as abstracted from physical being, social structure, and social action. So I am a human being. So these kind of more broader, sort of global constructs that are in here. Now, what I think is a really interesting question is whether our self-concept that we have is something that remains stable. So on the one hand, we might intuitively think that we have one single self-concept, and this is something that's fixed, it's stable, it's enduring. And to paraphrase Roy Baumeister, if we didn't have this single unified sense of the self, surely we would lose all kind of essence of who it is that we are. And similar, Manfred Kuhn shared this perspective. His underlying theoretical assumption was that everybody has one stable component of their self that just doesn't change from situation to situation. So that's one argument. On the other hand, there's lots of studies, and I think you could probably see this in some of your own personal experiences as well, that suggest we have a lot of variability in people's self-concepts across different situations. So when I asked you at the start to complete those statements about yourself, you may find yourself listing down some values, but they come with the caveat of, well, it depends. So you might say, I am kind, and that would be maybe a statement that you believe that you never deviate from being kind. That's just a non-negotiable. But there might also be other values that you write down that you know you have a little bit less consistency with. So for example, you might say, I'm talkative, but then you kind of think, well, yeah, normally I'm talkative, but there's certain situations where I won't be in it. It might depend upon who I'm with and my current mood state, how I'm feeling. So in one sense, I can be talkative, but at other times and in other selves, I can be relatively reserved and shy. So along this line of thinking, it was William James, and William James seems to be everywhere. He argued that, properly speaking, a man has as many social selves as there are individuals who recognize him and carry an image of him in their head. So this is the argument that we can be many different people in many different contexts. And I think we can all probably agree that we are not always the same person all of the time across all of the different domains that we inhabit. In different domains, we end up emphasizing different values. So how could we go about reconciling this issue of us having either a single or many different selves? One theory that was proposed by Marcus and Kunda in the 1980s was this idea that we have a global self-concept. So this is containing all of our different beliefs and self-knowledge that we have about ourselves. And this is something that is largely stable, so it doesn't change much. Obviously, as you grow up and develop as an individual, it's going to change or add to this self-concept, and it might grow over time. But generally, it has a large degree of stability. Yet within this global self-concept, only part of this is ever activated and accessible at any one time. And the activated part of this they refer to as the working self-concept. So you might be asking, why do we not activate the entire global self-concept the whole time? Why are we just picking out a little subset? So one answer to that is the fact that we maybe just don't have the capacity to attend to all of these things that are part of our own self-concept. So if we've got this really vast cognitive structure that's going to represent the self, us as humans, information processing capacity is generally very limited, and we can't activate this entire cognitive structure. What we can do is activate a smaller subset of it. So what then determines what gets activated in this working self-concept at any one time? So the contents of the working self-concept largely result from an interplay between the current social context that you're in and internal factors. So we're just drawing from this large pool of traits, beliefs, memories that you've got in this global self-concept, and picking out things that are relevant within the current context or align with internal factors such as your current mood state, motivations, etc. We also have parts of the working self-concept may be there because they are chronically accessible. So in other words, there might be certain beliefs or values that you continually over time keep activating. And because you're doing this over time, whatever situation you're in, they're just more likely to be activated and will stay part of your working self-concept. There's other self-knowledge that's going to be activated by the situational cues, motivational factors, so what is it you desire in the current circumstance, or the current mood that you're in. And then there's other elements that can be activated by the relational roles that you experience in the current situation. So for example, whether you are alone or with friends versus with a parent is probably going to influence the types of self-concepts that end up getting activated. So one notable feature of the working self-concept is the fact that our motivations can have a really important role in determining the things that end up getting activated. And particularly the fact that things that are deemed, attributes that are deemed desirable within the current context or current situation, these elements tend to be more strongly activated in our own personal self-concept. So one study that illustrates this, I think it's a nice clear study by Kunda and Sanatosio. So they examine how the desirability of different attributes, in this case personality traits, would influence people's self-conceptions. So whether the desirability of a trait influenced how likely you are to believe that that trait is part of your own self-concept. So in the study, they have 32 graduate students at the university that would read a fictitious study, and this study would either sell the benefits of being extroverted or would sell the benefits of being introverted. So in an extroversion success condition, you're basically reading a study that tells you extroverts do better at graduate school, or alternatively, in the introversion success, you're learning that introverts do better in grad school. Now, to make you actually focus on this study, they asked participants to write an explanation for this finding. So that just gets you thinking about it. You're kind of really processing the study rather than just sort of abstractly reading over it. So you're sort of invested with this idea that either extroversion or introversion is a really desirable and important personality trait. So in the second part, they then set this up as a supposedly unrelated task where they asked participants to generate statements about themselves. They had to say whether trait adjectives describe them or not. So you're basically completing a personality questionnaire. And the interesting part here is that depending on what condition you were in beforehand, influenced people's responses to these measures. So if you read the extroversion success story before, you're more likely to describe yourself as being more extroverted, and the same for the introversion condition. When you filled in the statements defining your self-concept before, can you notice any trend in the sorts of descriptors that you used? And specifically, can you think of any ways that your culture might have influenced the sort of responses that you give? So one finding that seems to occur on this is that in more interdependent cultures, so particularly sort of East Asian cultures, participants are much more likely to focus on social roles, as opposed to in more independent cultures, the emphasis and the focus is on personal traits and abilities such as being smart or athletic. So you should be very familiar already with this distinction between the sort of interdependent and independent. The interdependent self, which is something you tend to see more of in East Asian cultures, sees oneself as part of encompassing social relationships and then adjusting one's behaviour to the thoughts, feelings and actions of others in the relationship. So again, dominant in Asia, many regions of Africa and South America. Our self-esteem typically depends on the ability to restrain oneself and maintain harmony with others. I think as emphasized by the saying, the nail that sticks out gets hammered down. Whereas the independent self, typical or characteristic of Western culture, that emphasizes individuality and distinguishing oneself from others by emphasizing and using our unique talents. So dominant kind of view in North American and Western Europe is emphasized by the sort of be all you can be statement. So in a sort of pictorial figure, it look a little bit like this in individualist and collectivist cultures, where individualist, the self is largely separate and distinct from the relationship with other people and certainly from our social roles, whereas in collectivist cultures our sense of self is much more strongly intertwined with other people. So we see our friends and our mother, father, co-workers, siblings, etc. They form and overlap with our own parts of our own self-concept. Okay, so as a partial demonstration of this effect, there's some research by Ma and Schoenemann that examined the statements that people gave trying to define their self-concept. So essentially asking people to fill in the sort of 20 statements test, and then they wanted to look at what are the proportion of responses that people gave that included personal characteristics, so something like I'm smart, I'm confident, etc., versus the proportion of times that they described themselves relating to, that reflected specific roles or memberships to social groups, such as I'm a mother, I'm a psychologist, etc. And they did this to start off with in our kind of classic sample of weird American undergrads, so the Western educated, industrialized, rich, democratic sample. And then they did this with a range of participants in Kenya that differed in their degree of westernization. And you can see with our American undergrads, these are in blue, the proportion that described personal characteristics, much more strongly focused on that, and very little focus on the social roles and group membership. You get a similar result for Nairobi undergrads. So the explanation of that is that probably most of the undergrads in Nairobi are relatively well westernized, so they would have had a lot of exposure to Western influences. So this is something that gets really important when you're doing cross-cultural comparisons. If you then start going and selecting a subsample of participants in Kenya that end up being relatively rich, they're probably not necessarily that representative of the average Kenyan, whereas then when you ask workers in Nairobi, which are probably a lot more representative, already this shift towards much more focus on social roles. And then they go and investigate with the Maasai and the Samburu tribes. And with those, it's overwhelmingly emphasized on their self-concept is defined by their links and association with others. So we've got these cross-cultural influences on the self-concept, but then you also have cultural influences that occur as the norms and properties of a society change over time. So for example, the original work that was done by Louis researcher found that in the 1960s, you had individuals were much more likely to give B mode responses, whereas in the 70s and the 80s, people were much more likely to give these sort of C mode responses. So in other words, in the 50s, they're defining themselves based on their position within social roles and structures. I am a businessman, I'm a stock market, whatever, I'm a plumber, etc. But then in the 70s and 80s, people increasingly start to use more reflexive self-statements. So have a think if you can work out why might this be the case? Why might people shift away from the sort of social roles and structures? So one reason that they speculate is that maybe it starts to become harder to define yourself by your status and your social position as you start to live in a society where things are much more changeable. So whereas in the 50s you would often go into one job and that would be your role a lot of the time for life, you wouldn't change your career path. With a greater flexibility in jobs that people start to work, maybe they start to be less defined by their specific roles and focus more on individual characters.